Hello again, and welcome to Denton's Tales. Now, in this video, I am looking at a very famous Viking leader, one who was king of Dyflin, or Dublin, as it is now, controlling much of the lucrative slave trade of which Dyflin was the hub in those days. He was a leading figure in the great heathen army that conquered most of Britain in the 9th century, known as a great warrior, and he features very prominently in a modern television show. Not that he would probably recognize himself if he could come to our own time and see it. He certainly wouldn't recognize the costumes. Oh, dear me, no. With their biker leather more reminiscent of the Sons of Anarchy than anything Viking. I'm talking about Ivarr The Boneless, or as it is in English, Ivarr The Boneless. Oh yes, a very, very famous Viking indeed. There are some things to be borne in mind, however, with regards to Ivarr and his brothers. He is a historical figure, but we can't always be sure as to certain specific details about him or his brothers, because, for one thing, they are often mentioned by various names, which we assume refer to them, variations of their own names or names other people called them. So there is some confusion there possible. For example, Ivarr is referred to in various places as Hingwar, Ingur, Ingwar, Iwar, Imar, and Igwar. Yes, that's really just clear as mud, isn't it? A lot of his story is based, of course, on interpretations of the historical record, which we hope are correct, but we can't always be 100% certain. So what follows is what seems to be the most likely series of events based on those interpretations being correct. While we know that he was a genuine historical figure, there is a lot about him that is still a bit of a mystery, as well as various versions of his name, conflicting accounts, often contradicting other accounts, even from his own time. Well, that doesn't really help matters very much. He was said to be the son of the great hero Ragnar Sigurdsson, better known as Ragnar Lothbrok, and he had a number of brothers, the principal ones being Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, Uber, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Hvitserk. Now, yes, that's a problem right away. Because you see, Ragnar Lothbrok didn't actually exist. No, he seems to have been no more than a saga character, though probably based on several important Viking leaders whose genuine deeds were then attributed to Ragnar. So, you see, the problem is, if he didn't exist, well, his having children seems a bit unlikely from a biological point of view. I mean, how? So, what we do know that four of the brothers were genuine historical characters, since they are mentioned in historical documents rather than just in sagas or retelling of those sagas in the 13th century. Ivar, Halfdan, Uber, and Bjorn Ironside are actual historical figures. They did exist. Though the others, well, we really aren't sure about, and they may be just fictional characters. There's really no way to tell. They are not mentioned anywhere other than in sagas. A little bit more about Ragnar is in order before we proceed. Now, his name wasn't Lothbrok. That was a nickname meaning hairy breeches. From special breeches he was supposed to have worn, soaked in tar to protect him from the venom of a giant serpent, which he killed, winning the hand in marriage of his first wife, Thora. How romantic. And what a load of rubbish. Anyway, many Norsemen, of course, were known by a popular nickname rather than their actual surname. Bjorn Ironside, Harald Finehair, Gorm the Old, Eric Bloodaxe, for example. And Ragnar's real name was Sigurdsson, and his sons would have had the surname Ragnarsson. It has been suggested that a Jarl named Ragnar, who was said to have been the leader who attacked the city of Paris in 845 AD and was paid by the Frankish king to go away, was Ragnar Lothbrok. But there is absolutely no evidence that the particular man in question was ever known by that nickname, nor was anyone else, really, other than in the sagas, plus the fact that the breeches that resulted in the Lothbrok nickname were so called because they had helped the great hero to overcome a giant serpent. And giant serpents weren't really a great problem in Scandinavia nor around Paris during the ninth century, or anywhere else for that matter. Making Ragnar Lothbrok himself actually being a real person, just a bit unlikely. Nor did the Ragnar who raided Paris ever perform a similar feat while wearing tar-soaked breeches and win a wife, and thus that gentleman could hardly have claimed the nickname, even if he'd wanted to. For fans of the Vikings TV show, I must point out, I'm sorry if I burst any romantic bubbles here, that in the sagas, Ragnar Lothbrok was never married to Lagertha. No, as we've seen, his first wife was Thora, and after her death he married Oslo. Nor was she shot in the back with an arrow by Lagertha, and in fact she's described as quite a warrior herself in the sagas, leading an army on one occasion to attack Sweden. Good example of women's lib even back then. So, why were the four brothers seen as the sons of a man who didn't exist outside of sagas and poems? Which is a bit of a neat trick if you can do it. Well, the most likely explanation is that the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok was already well known, and the four brothers, and they were brothers in fact as far as we know, had a father called Ragnar. Now, a Ragnar, not the Ragnar, and thus their surname was Ragnarsson, and they simply used that to bolster their own importance, claiming a relationship with the great hero from the sagas. And after all, who was going to argue with the son of the great Ragnar Lothbrok? Oh, no, that wasn't going to happen. Now, Olafur the White became king of Dyflin, circa 853 AD, and the first actual mention of Ivarr, called by the Irish records as Imar, is 4 years later, in 857 AD, when he becomes joint king of Dyflin, reigning together with his kinsman Olafur and sharing the title King of the Foreigners. Now, he got off to an aggressive start, hardly surprising, I suppose. I mean, he was the fearsome Ivarr the Boneless, after all, ravaging County Meath to begin with, plundering Celtic tombs, such as those famous ones in the Boyne Valley, and he was involved in no little conflict with native Irish chieftains as a result, which I suppose was to be expected, though he later made alliances with some of them, including Cerbal, king of Ossory, so that he could leave Ireland and have allies at his back rather than enemies, since he had a great deal of ambition across the Irish Sea in Britain. Now, this was not an uncommon thing at that time, where a Norse jarl or king might help an Irish chieftain to fight another Irish chieftain, and then that Irish chieftain would help the Norse leader to fight other Norsemen. It wasn't always them or us, as many people believe these days. Anyway, following up on his overseas ambitions, Ivarr and Olafur left Dyflin in 865, along with Ivar's brothers Ubba and Halfdan, to head what the Anglo-Saxons referred to as the Great Heathen Army, along with a number of other Norse leaders, such as Guthrum, Ketil Harald, Sidroc, and Amund. The army composed mainly of Danish, Frisian, and Norwegian Vikings, their intention being to conquer Anglo-Saxon Britain. And the Saxon historian Ethelweard recorded that the fleets of the Viking tyrant Hingwar landed in England from the north. Hingwar being the most common Saxon name for Ivarr. Since most of the great army landed initially in East Anglia, one must assume that Ivarr had sailed around Scotland and down the North Sea. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that Hingwar, Hubba, and Halfdene were the leaders of the great army, using their Saxon names for them. Olafur, however, seems to have lost interest in conquering anything, and he returned to Dyflin fairly soon, leaving Ivarr to carry on with the army. Now, one frequently asked question is, how large was the Great Heathen Army? How great was it really? Since in those times, even a small group of men might be referred to as an army. In fact, the law code of the Kingdom of Wessex defined an army as comprising more than 35 men. Not really very much of an army. And even fairly large military groups at the time were quite small by the standards of later medieval armies, or preceding ones for that matter, such as the Roman legions or the huge army of Alexander the Great. For a long time it was assumed that the great army wasn't really all that great, perhaps maybe 1,000 men. But that that never really took into account the number of battles they fought, losing men in each one, but was still powerful enough each time a fresh Anglo-Saxon force arrived, which would seem to indicate a pretty large number, or at least a very plentiful supply of reinforcements, which is really the same thing, I suppose. But the small size of the great army's fortified camp at Repton on the River Trent, what was known as a long port, well, that did seem to agree with the opinion that the army could not have been very large. It was a D-shaped earthen rampart situated on the banks of the river, with the river forming the fourth wall, you might say, and incorporating a Christian church into the defences. But it really wasn't much larger than the churchyard had been. I mean, how great would an army be if you could fit it into a small churchyard? Obviously, not very, very big. But recent excavations at the Repton site have shown the army to have been considerably larger than previously thought, and confirmed that women and children accompanied it, as we might expect in those days when families would go with their menfolk. The fortified Longport was only a very small part of the camp, which spread out across a huge area beyond it, something like 130 acres, with workshops and smithies, ship repair yards, and so on. And that discovery raised the size of the great army by several thousand, showing that it was the largest Viking force to land in England before Harold Sigurdsson's invasion in 1066, and indeed the largest invasion force from anywhere else, in fact, since the arrival of the Roman legions centuries previously. You see, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes who conquered the ancient Britons after the withdrawal of the Roman legions, driving them into Wales and Cornwall, well, those invaders, they then became the Anglo-Saxons, but they arrived in stages, a group here and a group there, and gradually drove the ancient Britons to the west, and they landed in various locations, not in a single army landing in one place, which made the Great Heathen Army a bit different. The Kingdom of East Anglia, a section of the English coast that jutted out into the North Sea, was chosen quite deliberately, I'm sure, since it made a perfect landing place for ships coming down from Scandinavia, and it comprised the modern-day counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire, where King Edmund rather foolishly tried appeasement rather than resistance, deciding not to strike them when they would have been at their weakest, coming ashore and establishing their force on land, still bringing weapons and horses and things ashore. The perfect time to strike. No, he decided instead that he would offer them horses in return for peace. Yes, probably seemed like a good idea at the time, but it wasn't. Now, Ivarr accepted the offer, I'm sure laughing to himself at the naivety of King Edmund, who had just allowed an invading force intent on conquest to land unopposed, thinking that some horses were going to keep them safe. Oh, yes. As the American comedian Red Skelton used to say, he don't know me very well, do he? No, he didn't. Anyway, the Great Army spent some time at Thetford before marching north. By November of 866, they had reached the Anglo-Saxon trading city of Eoforwic, which is modern-day York, in the Kingdom of Northumbria, which they would rename Jorvik. Now, this is a very important city, located at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, which merged with other rivers before flowing down to the Humber and out into the North Sea, making it a thriving port and the access point to so much of northern England. Control Jorvik and you controlled Northumbria, which comprised the whole of northern England, from a line between modern-day Grimsby to Liverpool and right up to Edinburgh and the west coast of Scotland, including the former Kingdom of Berenicia. Ivarr and Halfdan attacked on the 1st of November, which just happened to be All Saints' Day, a very important Christian festival, which would be attended by everyone who was anyone. All important city leaders and officials, military commanders, and prominent citizens would be in the cathedral. And that may well have been the reason for their attack on that day, taking the city leaders by surprise. Or, of course, it could just have been a coincidence, but that does seem a bit unlikely. The Vikings gathered information as they moved, and Ivarr was noted for his military ability and cunning, so I'm sure he would have been very well aware of the Christian festivals and the chance of catching all these important people unawares in one place and far away from their command in the case of the military officials. In any case, the assault was fast and effective, and they captured the city, though the two kings who ruled in Northumbria, Aelle and Osbert, escaped. Taking the city gave the great army a dominance over most of northern England, right up to the Scottish border, and Jorvik would become a major centre of Norse occupation and trade for a couple of centuries afterwards. The army wintered on the River Tyne, but with most of the force absent, there was an uprising against them in Jorvik, incited by, yes, you might have known, Aelle and Osbert, who had popped up once again and attempted to reconquer the city, forcing the great army to retake it in 867, which they did without too much difficulty, but in a far more violent and bloody battle than the one previously, during which the two kings were killed. Now, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, recording that there was extensive slaughter made of the Northumbrians, after which Halfdan shared out the lands of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plough and to support themselves. Nasty Vikings. Some 150 years later, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also stated that the Vikings rebuilt the city of York, cultivated the land around it, and remained there. Now, interestingly enough, the Chronicle says nothing at all about King Aelle being executed in a particularly gruesome manner, just that he was killed, something I'll come back to in a moment. Without any leadership, all resistance to the great army ceased, and a local puppet king, one Egbert, was installed in Jorvik, though of course he had no actual power himself, and he was simply there to pass on orders from Ivarr and the other Viking leaders, and collect taxes to further the great army. Later on, Halfdan Ragnarsson was named the first Norse king, of Northumbria. The legend of Ivarr, of course, says that King Aelle was killed with the extremely unpleasant blood eagle, where someone's back was cut open, the ribs were smashed, and the lungs were pulled out and left hanging, like the wings of the bird, hence the name, in retaliation for his having thrown Ragnar Lothbrok into a pit of vipers. And in fact, that was the reason for Ivarr and his brothers even being there. Well, yeah, again, a nice story, but a little questionable. Firstly, there is no mention of any such thing in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a pretty accurate record of events at that time, and in which the monks wrote down just about everything of interest that occurred, nor is it mentioned in the Irish annals. And, I think chucking a great Viking leader into a pit of vipers would have got a mention, had, of course, Ragnar Lothbrok actually existed in order to be chucked in it in the first place, and King Aelle just happened to have a big pit full of vipers handy to chuck him into, both of which seem highly unlikely. It was also said that after the first battle, Ivarr had come to an arrangement with King Aelle, that he would cease raiding if he was granted all the land he could cover with the hide of an ox, and the king agreed. Now that suggests King Aelle would have lost an IQ test to the village idiot, because why would a great Viking warlord fight a battle just to gain enough ground to make a bed on? Of course, the cunning Ivarr cut the ox hide into such thin little pieces that he stretched it all the way around the city, thus enabling him to claim it as his, which is obviously impossible unless the ox was bigger than an elephant. But this is a bit strange, because it's very similar to tales from other lands, such as here in Ireland, where St. Bridget was said to have asked the King of Leinster, who was reluctant to give her anything, for as much land as her cloak could cover. Now, the Irish king was obviously just as dim-witted as King Aelle, and never suspected that there was something a little odd about this request for such a tiny bit of land, and he agreed. But see, Bridget didn't lay it down. Oh, no. She gave the four corners of it to four of her nuns and told them to run towards the 4 points of the compass, the cloak expanding as they did so, covering many acres of land, and forcing the king to concede to her demands. Cut up ox hide, expanding cloak, it's pretty much the same story, and equally improbable. Anyway, in part two we shall return to those things that did actually happen following the further progress of the great heathen army. So, until next time, I shall say farewell, goodbye for now, and see you